The hurricane that swept over Galveston, Texas on Saturday, September 8, 1900 was the deadliest hurricane in U.S. history. It left 6,000 to 12,000 dead and inflicted almost $30 billion in damage. This was a hurricane that changed history in the city of Galveston, Texas forever. One Day in September, the Great Galveston Hurricane by Varsha, Bansal. On the rain-darkened and gusty morning of Saturday, September 8, 1900, the residents of Galveston, Texas went about minding their own business. Captain J.W. Simons, the master of the 1,169-ton steel-hulled steam freighter Pensacola, set sail at 7 a.m. from the dock. Wilbur Goodman spent the day swimming and chatting with friends at the YMCA. Miss Charles Vidor got a call from her cousin, telling her to bring her son down to the beach to play with the other children and have a look at the surf. No one knew that the deadliest hurricane in U.S. history was heading towards them. In the aftermath of the devastating 1900 hurricane, the people of Galveston, Texas felt their government had failed in their responsibility to protect them. They knew they had the right to protection and undertook the responsibility to safeguard their future residents and their city by the sea. Galveston's geography greatly influenced the impact of the storm. Evidence shows that the Gulf of Mexico got very hot when the hurricane was coming. Galveston was also a barrier island trying to become a major city in the south. It was low-lying, only 8.7 feet above sea level, and there was water on both sides, the Gulf on one side and the bay on the other. The storm swept off the Gulf of Mexico, packing winds up to 135 miles per hour. When the hurricane hit, it damaged Galveston with ease due to its low topography, 15-foot surge waves. The storm was ranked a Category 4 in modern technology. Dr. Isaac Klein was entrusted with the responsibility to keep the people of Galveston, Texas safe. On September 8, 1900, he filled in this duty. Dr. Isaac Klein was the chief of the U.S. Weather Service Bureau during the 1900 hurricane. People view Isaac Klein in two different ways. One as a hero frantically warned people of the impending danger of the hurricane as the water levels were already rising. Other people view him as an arrogant man who did not think Galveston could be struck by a hurricane of such fierce intensity. Calling hurricanes tropical cyclones, Isaac wrote an article in 1891 for the Galveston News in which he said anyone who thought a tropical cyclone could do real damage to Galveston was the victim of an absurd delusion. Before the hurricane hit, a group of town officials in Galveston had thought about building seawalls. Seawalls were in consideration because the town that was only 150 miles away from Galveston had two major hurricane hits in the space of 11 years. In 1875, the town of Indianola, Texas was hit by a storm where Sergeant T.A. Smith observed winds that must have been fully 100 miles an hour. The storm killed 176 people. The next hurricane hit Indianola again in 1886. According to the Signal Corps, the water in the bay commenced to rise rapidly. The appearance of the town after the storm was so bad that the residents of Indianola had abandoned the town. Some men calling themselves the Progressive Association began clamoring to build seawalls in Galveston, acknowledging the fact that the chances were high that a bad storm might occur in their hometown. The city's engineer, E.M. Hartrick, went so far as to draft plans for the wall. He proposed a dike 10 feet high extending completely around the island, except for the north side. The state authorized the money to pay for the work, but Hartrick wrote, this was some months after the flood, and by then the attitude was, oh, we'll never get another one, and they didn't build. Klein himself dismissed the idea of the seawall, calling it a needless expense. The seawall was not built. In the days and weeks leading up to the devastating storm, there was little indication of the approaching monster. Newspapers from the surrounding cities talk of trade and business, a sharp contrast to the media frenzy that precedes hurricanes today. The Klein brothers did have some early warnings of the approaching storm, however. Meteorologists from Cuba reported a storm of moderate intensity striking Cuba on September 1st, unleashing heavy rains before reaching the open water of the Gulf on September 5th. Isaac Klein assumed that it would curve northeast, across Florida and into the Atlantic, but his colleagues in Cuba insisted that it would continue to the west, striking Texas. U.S. forecasters had an unfortunate history of downplaying or ignoring forecasts from Cuba. According to Eric Larson, author of Isaac's Storm, the U.S. guys were pretty full of themselves, kind of believed that they had the lock on the weather and treated the indigenous Cuban weathermen with great disdain. Historians also believe that if the Kleins had believed the Cuban forecast, they probably wouldn't have issued a warning to the residents of Galveston. Larson continues, within the Bureau there was a ban on issuing local storm warnings, the fear being that this would cause panic and so forth, and if this storm never came, then it would be an embarrassment. On that fateful day in September, many headed to the beach in search of relief from the extreme heat. The wind rose, the waves grew higher. The majority of the population was unconcerned by the rain clouds that began rolling in by mid-morning, and the water that started to flow through the streets. According to resident Louisa Rolfing, the children had a grand time picking up driftwood and other things that floated down the street. She also said, for a while, even ladies were wading in the water thinking it was fun. Isaac Klein had since stated, finally seriously concerned, he took his horse and buggy down to the beach and other low-lying areas and warned people of the storm's approach. He had stated, some 6,000 lives were saved by my advice and warnings. No other survivors corroborated this account. As the afternoon continued, disturbing stories began circulating. The two oldest Rolfing children returned from the beach with stories of how the waves on the Gulf were so immense they were breaking apart the big bathhouses. Louisa remembers thinking it wasn't fun anymore. At 2 in the afternoon, residents began to realize that the storm was significant. They began seeking shelter on higher ground. The Rolfing family reported hearing the shattering of windows in their home. It sounded, said Louisa Rolfing, as if the rooms were filled with 1,000 little devils, shrieking and whistling. Trains, however, continued pulling into Galveston. Civil engineer A.V. Kellogg reported, when we crossed the bridge over Galveston Bay, the water had reached an elevation 2 feet below the level of the track. The water began to rise 8 to 10 inches over the track. Passenger John H. Poe didn't trust the trestle. He decided to make for a nearby lighthouse with 9 other passengers. 85 remained aboard. None on the train would survive that night. By 5:30 p.m., the water was waist deep in the streets. Joseph Klein urged evacuation. Isaac Klein insisted they stay. By 6:30 p.m., Isaac Klein calculated the tide was 15.2 feet deep in his neighborhood, 9 feet deep on his first floor and still rising. Houses began collapsing into the rushing water and coming off their foundations, floating along the streets. Bricks were blown about like their little feathers. At St. Mary's Orphanage on the beach, the 93 children and 10 sisters were under siege. The approximately 42,000 residents of Galveston braced for a night of horrors. When the water finally receded and the wind slowed, thousands of residents were missing, including the children at the orphanage. In the days and weeks following the storm, the death toll rose and rose until it reached 6,000. Historians estimate that a total of 10,000 to 12,000 people died from the storm. More than 3,600 homes were destroyed on Galveston Island, and that added toll on commercial structures created a monetary loss of $30 million, about $700 million in today's dollars. Now the rebuilding must begin. Sunday morning, the day after the disaster, began with the sound of bells from the ruined Ursuline convent, calling people to worship, wrote historian David G. McComb in Galveston, A History. It was a fitting beginning. The city immediately began rebuilding. The very next morning, Mayor Walter C. Jones had called emergency city council meetings, and by the end of the day had appointed a central relief committee. The committee decided on 2 engineering projects, building a seawall and raising the island's elevation, suggestions that had been made only a decade earlier by the city's engineer, E.M. Hartrick. In 1886, he felt building these structures was a responsible thing to do. Isaac Klein had disagreed. Now everyone agreed. A team of 3 engineers hired in 1901 recommended raising the city by 17 feet. Sand was dredged from Galveston Channel. All structures, gas, water lines, and sewers were raised. Homeowners were responsible for raising their own homes. 11 years after the storm, 500 blocks were raised by 11 feet. The most obvious of Galveston's efforts to prevent a repeat of 1900's devastation is the long-debated seawall. Over a period of 60 years, 10 miles were built, 15.6 feet above sea level. In 1915, the wall was tested when another hurricane bore down on Galveston. The city flooded and buildings outside the protection of the wall were destroyed. The damage and loss of life was nothing compared to 15 years earlier. While the cost of $16 million, most of the responsibility of the town, it allows the citizens of Galveston their essential right to protection against the elements. Historian David McComb wrote, "The public defenses against nature came at a high cost, but they succeeded for the most part. Its struggle for survival against nature through the application of technology represents the strongest tradition of Western civilization. Galveston's response to the Great Storm was its finest hour."